On June 24th, 2026, the Pentagon published a 25-page document that used a word senior military officials almost never use in official, on-the-record policy language: existential. Not significant, not serious. Existential, applied specifically to what happens to America's nuclear command and control systems, its coordinated military maneuvers, and nearly every single deployed weapons platform if quantum computing continues advancing on its current trajectory. This wasn't the first time officials connected to the Pentagon had used that particular word in connection with quantum computing, but it was the first time the Department of War itself, formally, officially, in binding written policy, put that exact word directly into an enterprise-wide strategy with hard deadlines attached. Today, we're breaking down exactly what this new strategy actually says, why the Pentagon chose this particular moment to escalate its own language dramatically, and what it genuinely means for the future of American military communications. Let's start with the basic threat itself, because you genuinely can't understand why the Pentagon reached for a word as strong as existential without first understanding exactly what's actually at stake here. Nearly every piece of sensitive military communication currently relies on cryptography, the mathematical systems that scramble information so that only authorized parties can actually read it. That includes everything from routine email traffic between military bases all the way up to the specific communications that would authorize and coordinate the deployment of America's own nuclear arsenal. If a sufficiently powerful quantum computer ever becomes capable of breaking today's standard encryption methods, an adversary wouldn't just be reading someone's email. They could potentially intercept, decode, or in the worst case scenarios, disrupt exactly the communications that keep America's entire military command structure functioning as intended. The new strategy, released by the Department of War, spells out that specific worst case scenario in genuinely stark, direct language rarely seen in typically hedged government policy documents. The strategy explicitly states that cryptography functions as a foundational mission enabler across nearly every single Department of War system currently in operation. And then it goes further, naming the two absolute worst-case scenarios directly, stating plainly that insecure communications pose an existential threat to Department of War missions, specifically regarding the authorization and deployment of nuclear weapons, and the execution of coordinated maneuvers with mission partners. Those aren't vague, abstract concerns about some distant, theoretical future problem. Those are two of the single most consequential categories of military communication that exist anywhere within the entire United States government, named directly and specifically as facing existential risk. Let's talk about that word second specifically, because it's worth being genuinely precise about what it actually refers to, rather than simply accepting a catchy headline framing at face value. This wasn't literally the first time anyone connected to the Pentagon had ever used the word existential in the same sentence as quantum computing. Officials and outside experts have invoked that same language informally in speeches, interviews, and less formal policy discussions for several years now, going back at least to warnings from the department's own outgoing chief data officer back in 2022, who publicly called for urgent Pentagon investment specifically to counter potential quantum-enabled espionage threats. What genuinely distinguishes this particular June 2026 strategy is that it represents the first time that exact existential framing has been formally, deliberately written directly into binding, enterprise-wide Department of War policy, complete with specific dates, specific deadlines, and specific accountability structures attached, rather than simply appearing as a memorable soundbite in a conference speech or a magazine interview. That distinction between informal warning and formal, binding policy genuinely matters considerably more than it might initially seem. A senior official saying something sounds existential in an interview creates a headline. A 25-page department-wide strategy formally codifying that exact same language, complete with legally binding deadlines that trigger real budgetary and compliance obligations across the entire defense industrial base, creates genuine institutional accountability. Congress can hold hearings referencing this specific document. Inspectors general can audit compliance against these specific deadlines. Defense contractors can be held to these specific standards through the CMMC framework we'll discuss shortly. That's a meaningfully different, considerably more consequential category of government action than simply escalating rhetoric in a public appearance. And it genuinely helps explain why this particular June 2026 release generated as much sustained attention within the specialized defense and cybersecurity press as it actually did. Let's talk about the specific technical threat driving all of this urgency, because it has a formal name that's genuinely worth understanding. The strategy repeatedly references something called a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, abbreviated CRQC, which represents a quantum computer powerful and stable enough to actually break the specific encryption standards protecting military and civilian systems today. And here's the genuinely important, honest caveat that the strategy itself explicitly, directly acknowledges: no such machine currently exists anywhere in the world today. This isn't a strategy responding to an active, ongoing attack. It's a strategy responding to a future possibility that experts increasingly believe is arriving faster than previously projected, even though nobody can currently say with any real precision exactly when that specific threshold will actually be crossed. That uncertainty around timing is genuinely worth sitting with carefully, because it's exactly the specific detail that separates thoughtful, well-calibrated policy analysis from pure, unhelpful alarmism. A March 2026 survey conducted by cryptographer Dr. Michelle Mosca through the Global Risk Institute found that expert estimates for the probability a cryptographically relevant quantum computer will actually emerge within the next 10 years have climbed to somewhere between 28 and 49%, representing the single highest estimate recorded across that same survey's entire 7-year running history. That's a genuinely meaningful, significant increase in expert confidence that this threat is approaching faster than previously believed. Even the higher end of that specific range, 49%, still means slightly more. Experts surveyed believe the specific 10-year threshold will not be crossed, then believe it will. Let's also talk about a separate piece of entire sense of accelerating urgency, because it connects directly to research we've covered elsewhere on this channel regarding other quantum-threatened cryptographic systems. A May 2025 paper by Google quantum AI researcher Craig Gidney revised downward the estimated number of physical qubits required to break the widely used RSA 2048 encryption standard, moving that estimate from roughly 20 million qubits down to under 1 million, representing a genuinely massive 95% reduction in the estimated hardware requirements for a successful attack. That kind of dramatic downward revision in required computing resources is precisely exactly the sort of research finding that compresses expert timeline estimates and explains why Pentagon officials increasingly feel they can no longer comfortably treat this specific threat as some distant, multi-decade away concern that future administrations can simply continue kicking down the road indefinitely. Now, let's talk about exactly what this new strategy actually requires the Pentagon to do, because the specific deadlines involved genuinely matter and deserve careful, precise attention. The strategy sets a binding requirement that all high-impact national security systems be secured with post-quantum cryptography by December 31st, 2030. It then extends that same requirement across the entire broader military force, covering every single deployed system, Department of War-wide by December 31st, 2031. Department of War Chief Information Officer Kirsten Davies, writing directly in the strategy's own introduction, offered a genuinely sobering, honest summary of exactly how far-reaching this transition is actually going to be, stating plainly that nearly every deployed military asset will be affected in some way, that adversaries will continue probing for weaknesses throughout this entire transition period, and that meaningful costs will inevitably be incurred along the way. That specific phrase, nearly every deployed military asset, genuinely deserves a moment of careful reflection, because it captures the sheer, almost overwhelming scale of what this strategy is actually asking the Department of War to accomplish. This isn't a narrow, contained IT upgrade limited to a handful of specific communication systems or a small number of headquarters networks. It's a comprehensive migration touching battlefield communications equipment, command and control infrastructure, weapons platforms, logistics networks, and the entire sprawling defense industrial base of private contractors that build and maintain equipment for the American military. Defense Information Systems Agency leaders have been genuinely direct and honest about exactly how demanding this specific undertaking is going to be, telling reporters covering this story that transitioning to post-quantum cryptography will require years of dedicated testing, engineering work, and infrastructure modernization before it's genuinely complete. Now let's talk about that word modernization for a moment, because it points directly toward a genuinely important, often overlooked, complication buried inside this entire transition. At TechNet Cyber 2026, DISA's own .NET chief engineer Mike Butler specifically noted that early prototyping work has already revealed the department will need to actively adjust its own requirements as this migration effort continues progressing forward. In his own words, prototyping work can genuinely reveal that the eventual end of what was originally planned, sometimes introducing entirely new requirements that weren't initially considered from a defensive cyber operations perspective. That's a genuinely honest, refreshingly candid admission from someone directly involved in this technical work, acknowledging clearly that this entire multi-year transition isn't simply a matter of installing a predetermined software update everywhere simultaneously. It's an evolving, iterative engineering process where the department is actively learning and adjusting its own plan as real-world testing reveals genuinely unanticipated complications along the way. If you're finding this kind of grounded, technically precise breakdown of exactly how major government security policy actually gets implemented genuinely useful, this channel focuses on exactly this kind of careful, source-backed defense and technology analysis regularly. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because there's plenty more of this kind of detailed breakdown coming your way. Let's talk about the money involved here, because a transition of this genuine scale doesn't come cheap, and understanding the financial dimension genuinely helps calibrate exactly how seriously Congress and the broader defense budget process are likely to treat this specific mandate going forward. Defense research, development, testing, and evaluation spending has already surged well, past $179 billion, with quantum technology specifically anchored as a designated critical technology area for maintaining American military dominance more broadly. That broader budget context matters because it signals this particular post-quantum cryptography transition isn't competing for funding in isolation. It's part of a considerably larger, sustained pattern of quantum-related defense investment that spans everything, from sensor development to communication security to the underlying quantum computing research itself. That said, funding a strategy on paper and actually sustaining that funding consistently across multiple consecutive budget cycles, spanning what will likely be at least 2 separate presidential administrations before the 2031 deadline arrives, are genuinely 2 different things. Major multi-year federal technology transitions have historically faced real risk of funding disruption whenever political priorities shift, whenever budget negotiations grow contentious, or whenever competing national security priorities suddenly demand more urgent attention. CIO Kirsten Davies herself explicitly acknowledged in the strategy's own introduction that meaningful costs will inevitably be incurred throughout this transition, a refreshingly direct acknowledgement that this isn't going to be a cheap, painless undertaking, and one that implicitly signals the department expects to need sustained, dependable congressional support well beyond just the current budget cycle alone. Let's also talk about how this entire strategy fits into the Pentagon's own broader technology modernization struggles. Because quantum cryptography isn't actually being implemented into some kind of pristine, already modernized technical environment. CIO Davies has separately spoken publicly about the department's own ongoing efforts to reduce what she specifically calls technology debt. Essentially, the accumulated backlog of aging, outdated systems and software that the department has continued relying on well past their originally intended service life. Layering a genuinely ambitious, department-wide cryptographic transition on top of an already strained technology modernization effort adds a meaningfully complicating dimension to this entire undertaking, since some of the specific systems that most urgently need post-quantum protection may simultaneously be among the department's oldest, least flexible, and most technically difficult systems to actually upgrade in the first place. Let's talk about the timing of this entire strategy's release, because it wasn't actually an isolated standalone announcement. It arrived just one single day after President Trump signed 2 separate executive orders, specifically setting comparable post-quantum cryptography deadlines for civilian federal agencies more broadly, part of a broader executive order titled Securing the Nation Against Advanced Cryptographic Attacks. That specific sequencing, a sweeping civilian federal directive followed immediately by the Pentagon's own considerably more detailed military-specific implementation strategy, genuinely suggests this represents a coordinated, whole-of-government policy push rather than the Department of War acting entirely on its own, independent initiative separate from the rest of the federal government's own broader quantum preparation efforts. That broader civilian executive order directed federal agencies more generally to transition their own high-value assets and high-impact systems to post-quantum cryptography by that exact same December 31st, 2030 deadline, alongside requiring agencies to submit prioritized migration plans through new implementation guidance issued by the Office of Management and Budget. Understanding that broader civilian context genuinely matters, because it means the Pentagon's own specific strategy isn't operating in complete isolation. It's the military-specific implementation of a considerably broader national policy shift, one specifically designed to push the entire federal government, not just the Department of War alone, toward quantum-resistant cryptography on essentially the exact same accelerated overall timeline. Let's talk about the 5 major lines of effort this strategy actually lays out, because understanding the specific structure genuinely helps clarify exactly how the Pentagon plans to actually execute something this genuinely massive in scope. The strategy organizes its work around 5 major lines of effort, supported by 8 associated strategic goals, covering areas that include fully understanding the department's own most consequential cryptographic vulnerabilities, establishing genuine governance and coordination structures capable of managing a transition this large and complex, and building out the actual technical infrastructure and testing capacity required to validate that new quantum. Resistant systems genuinely work correctly before they're deployed at scale across genuinely mission-critical military systems. That specific emphasis on first fully understanding existing vulnerabilities before rushing into wholesale replacement genuinely matters. And it connects directly to something the Pentagon had already begun working on well before this particular June's 2026 strategy was formally released. As early as November of the prior year, the Pentagon had already published an initial plan specifically focused on identifying vulnerabilities within its existing cryptographic systems and beginning the process of phasing out outdated encryption methods. That earlier November effort represented a genuinely important, necessary foundational step, essentially conducting a comprehensive inventory of exactly which systems across the entire Department of War currently rely on cryptography that would eventually become vulnerable to a sufficiently powerful quantum computer before the department could realistically commit to the kind of binding, department-wide deadlines this newer June 2026 strategy formally established. Let's talk about how Allied coordination fits into this entire picture, because national security communications rarely stay purely national in scope, particularly for a military as deeply integrated with Allied partners as the United States. NATO published its own first-ever quantum strategy, specifically addressing exactly this kind of emerging battlefield reality. Recognizing that a meaningful portion of America's own most sensitive military communications specifically involve coordination with Allied partners, exactly the same category of communication this Pentagon strategy explicitly names as facing existential risk. If America's own systems transition to post-quantum cryptography on a different timeline, or using different specific technical standards than its NATO allies and other coalition partners, that mismatch could genuinely create new categories of interoperability problems precisely at the moment when coordinated, secure communication matters most, during an actual military operation involving multiple allied nations working together. That interoperability challenge is explicitly acknowledged within the Pentagon's own strategy, specifically regarding the defense industrial base, where officials have committed to collaborating directly with industry partners to ensure smooth, genuinely more complex diplomatic and technical challenge than simply coordinating with domestic contractors, since it requires aligning timelines, technical standards, and implementation priorities across multiple sovereign governments, each with their own separate budget cycles, political considerations, and existing technology infrastructure investments that may not always neatly align with America's own specific 2030 and 2031 deadlines. Let's also talk about what happens for military branches and specific weapons platforms that simply cannot realistically meet these deadlines, because the strategy itself has to grapple honestly with the reality that not every single system across such an enormous, sprawling technical inventory can plausibly be upgraded on exactly the same accelerated timeline. Older weapons platforms, some of which remain in active service for decades after their initial design and deployment, were often built using cryptographic hardware that's genuinely difficult or even physically impossible to upgrade without replacing entire hardware components, rather than simply installing a straightforward software update, the way a modern computer network typically could be. The strategy's own language explicitly acknowledges this exact tension, stating that department systems must support post-quantum cryptography or be phased out entirely by the 2030 deadline for the highest priority category, a framing that genuinely signals some older systems may need to be retired altogether rather than upgraded, if upgrading them proves technically infeasible or prohibitively expensive within the given time frame. That specific phase-out provision genuinely matters for understanding the full scope of what this strategy actually requires. It's not simply asking every existing system to be patched and upgraded in place. It's implicit why, acknowledging that some meaningful portion of the department's existing technical inventory will likely need to be retired and replaced entirely, a genuinely significant undertaking that touches directly on procurement timelines, defense contractor relationships, and potentially the operational availability of specific military capabilities during whatever transition period is required to bring their replacements fully online. Let's talk about the defense industrial base specifically, because this is genuinely one of the more consequential and considerably less discussed dimensions of this entire strategy. The Department of War doesn't operate in isolation. It relies on an enormous, sprawling network of private contractors, ranging from massive, well-known defense corporations all the way down to small, specialized parts suppliers, all of whom regularly handle sensitive Department of War information as part of their own normal contracting relationships with the government. This new strategy explicitly states that the department will ensure this entire defense industrial base migrates to post-quantum cryptography right alongside the department's own internal systems, and that the department will collaborate directly with its industry partners, specifically to ensure genuine interoperability throughout this entire migration process. That specific requirement is being implemented through an existing compliance framework called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, commonly abbreviated CMMC, which the Pentagon began actively enforcing across its contractor base back in 2025. According to the strategy's own stated plans, CMMC requirements will be specifically updated to incorporate post-quantum cryptography standards, meaning private companies hoping to continue winning and maintaining defense contracts will genuinely need to demonstrate their own compliance with these same quantum-resistant cryptography requirements, not just the Pentagon's own internal government systems alone. Security experts covering this specific development have noted this move isn't particularly surprising given CMMC's own history, since the entire program was explicitly designed from the outset to evolve continuously as cybersecurity threats themselves continue evolving over time, rather than remaining a fixed, static, one-time compliance checklist. That specific detail genuinely matters enormously for the broader defense contracting industry. Well beyond just the Pentagon's own internal bureaucracy, thousands of private companies, many of them considerably smaller than the household name defense giants most people immediately think of when they picture military contractors, will now need to genuinely invest real-time, money, and specialized technical expertise into upgrading their own internal cryptographic systems, specifically to remain eligible for continued defense contracting work going forward. For smaller contractors operating with genuinely limited cybersecurity budgets, and considerably less in-house technical expertise than the largest defense primes possess, this specific requirement could represent a genuinely significant, meaningful new operational and financial burden, even while the underlying security rationale driving that requirement remains genuinely sound and well justified. Let's talk honestly about the skepticism this entire strategy has also genuinely, legitimately generated, because not every single response to this announcement has been purely supportive or celebratory, and a fair, balanced treatment of this story genuinely requires acknowledging that meaningful pushback directly. Some experts covering this specific transition have raised genuine, well-founded concerns about whether both the broader defense industrial base and the underlying post-quantum cryptographic technology itself are genuinely, fully ready for a transition happening on this particular accelerated timeline. Post-quantum cryptographic algorithms, while formally standardized by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, remain considerably newer and considerably less battle-tested in genuinely large-scale, real-world deployment compared to the decades-old, extensively validated encryption standards they're specifically designed to eventually replace. That specific tension between genuine, well-founded urgency about a real and accelerating future threat and genuine, equally well-founded caution about deploying still relatively new cryptographic technology across systems as consequential as nuclear command and control infrastructure represents exactly the kind of difficult, genuinely balanced trade-off this entire strategy has to navigate carefully. Move too slowly, and the department risks being caught genuinely unprepared if a cryptographically relevant quantum computer arrives faster than currently projected. Move too quickly, without sufficiently thorough testing and validation, and the department risks introducing entirely new categories of vulnerability into precisely the systems this strategy is specifically designed to protect, simply because the newer, still maturing replacement cryptography hasn't yet been proven as thoroughly reliable as the older standards it's meant to replace. Let's talk about the Pentagon's own Chief Information Officer's specific framing of this entire challenge, because it genuinely captures this exact tension particularly well. Speaking separately at the SAP Now Summit in Washington, D.C., Kirsten Davies specifically described this new strategy as ensuring the integrity of Department of War systems for decades to come, while also being genuinely candid and direct that this particular network modernization effort represents, in her own words, only a first step in genuinely readying the United States military for this specific future threat. That's a refreshingly honest, appropriately modest characterization from a senior official overseeing exactly this kind of massive department-wide transition, acknowledging clearly that publishing a comprehensive written strategy, however genuinely thorough and well-considered, represents the genuine beginning of a considerably longer, more difficult implementation journey, rather than anything resembling a finished, completed solution to this specific problem. Let's also talk about the broader geopolitical dimension driving much of this entire sense of urgency, because it connects directly to competitive dynamics we've covered elsewhere on this channel regarding the broader US-China quantum computing race. Leaders across the US government have increasingly raised genuine, sustained concerns about how quantum computing technology could specifically be exploited by strategic adversaries, particularly China, whose own aggressive, sustained, centrally coordinated investment in quantum technology has already been extensively documented and covered elsewhere. The specific concern here isn't limited purely to encryption-breaking capability either. Quantum-enabled sensors, quantum communications networks, and other related quantum technologies could each separately provide meaningful military advantages to whichever nation manages to master them first, adding genuinely additional layers of competitive urgency on top of the core cryptographic concerns this specific strategy most directly primarily addresses. That specific harvest now, decrypt later concept we've discussed in prior videos regarding other targeted systems applies here with genuinely, arguably, even greater consequence than in almost any other context we've previously covered. Sophisticated state-level adversaries don't need a working cryptographically relevant quantum computer today to begin positioning themselves advantageously for this specific future threat. They can simply intercept and store today's encrypted military communications right now, patiently waiting for quantum computing technology to eventually mature to the point where those specific, already captured communications can genuinely be decrypted and read. For information with a genuinely long shelf life of continued strategic relevance, weapon system specifications, long-term strategic planning documents, or nuclear command protocol specifically, that patient long-term waiting game represents a genuinely serious ongoing risk right now, today, entirely independent of exactly when a working cryptographically relevant quantum computer eventually actually arrives. Let's zoom out and talk about why the specific choice of language in this strategy. Using the actual word existential in formal, binding written policy genuinely matters beyond simply representing dramatic, attention-grabbing rhetoric. Government strategy documents, particularly ones issued by an institution as historically measured and typically cautious in its own public language as the Department of War, generally choose their words with genuine, deliberate care. Escalating from more routine and measured language like significant risk or serious concern, all the way up to the considerably stronger, more consequential word existential represents a genuinely deliberate signal, both to Congress, which will need to continue funding this multi-year transition, and to the broader defense industrial base, which will need to actually execute considerable portions of this work themselves, that the department genuinely views this specific threat as belonging in the same fundamentally serious category as the most severe consequential risks the United States military ever formally prepares against. So let's bring this all together and land on the actual, complete, honest bottom line here. The Pentagon's new post-quantum cryptography strategy genuinely does represent a significant formal escalation in how directly and explicitly the department is now willing to characterize the quantum computing threat in official, binding written policy, explicitly invoking existential level language specifically regarding nuclear command and control communications and coordinated military operations with allied partners. That escalation arrives against a backdrop of genuinely accelerating, though still honestly uncertain, expert timeline. Estimates for when a genuinely threat-capable quantum computer might actually emerge, somewhere between roughly a 1 in 4 and 1 in 2 chance within the coming decade, according to the most recent, most rigorous available survey of credentialed expert opinion on this exact question. The strategy itself sets genuinely ambitious, binding deadlines, 2030 for the department's highest priority systems and 2031 for the entire remaining force, backed by a coordinated whole-of-government policy push that extends well beyond the Pentagon alone into civilian federal agencies and the DEZEP, entire private defense industrial base. Whether the department and the thousands of private contractors it depends on can genuinely execute a transition, this technically demanding and organizationally massive on that specific accelerated timeline remains a genuinely open, honestly uncertain question, one that officials directly involved in the actual implementation work have themselves been refreshingly candid about, acknowledging clearly that considerable technical, organizational, and financial challenges still remain squarely ahead throughout this entire multi-year undertaking. If this deep dive into exactly why the Pentagon chose to formally invoke existential threat language around quantum computing gave you a genuinely clearer picture of what's actually driving this entire policy shift, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this kind of careful source-backed defense and technology reporting reach more people who are trying to understand exactly how seriously their own government is treating a threat that still, honestly, remains years away from actually materializing. And if you want more of exactly this kind of grounded, evidence-based look at where national security policy and emerging technology actually intersect with each other, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. And keep an eye on 2030, specifically because that's the year this entire strategy's first binding deadline actually arrives, and it will tell us a great deal about whether formal, written existential threat language actually translates into the kind of sustained, well-funded execution this transition genuinely requires.